What's going on, everyone? Today's video, I just wanted to go over different types of stitching tools. These are not expensive tools by any means, so if you do spend more on something a bit more high-end, you will probably get better results. But I just wanted to go over the different types and kind of show how they each work, as well show how they look with different sizes of thread. So to start, I'm going to go over the first one, which is the diamond-shaped stitching chisel. This tool is a pretty common tool, and it's probably, in my opinion, the most beginner-friendly because it does have a center point for each prong, meaning when you use a wing divider or a stitching groover on your leather to determine where you want your stitches to be, you can just place the center point onto the line and then use your mallet to hammer through. Then you have your stitching holes punched. This stitching chisel also has a very easy time going through multiple layers of leather or thicker leather where other ones might not be able to handle. Another good thing about these is that you can buy a set for around $20, and they come with a 6-prong, a 4-prong, a 2-prong, and a 1-prong. This way it'll be easy to go long distances using the 6-prong, or you can go around corners using the 2 and 1 prong. The only downside about these is that they do have a puckering effect when you punch through the leather, meaning that you're going to have to determine which side you want to look nicer, whether it's the outside of the leather good or the inside of the leather good, because the backside of where you punch is going to have a bit of frayed leather around each hole. There's some things you can do to help with this, whether it's re-punching the holes through the backside, or if you use an awl to kind of push through any of the holes. And you can make it look pretty nice, but as far as time goes, you know, these are a pretty good tool just to put down into the line, hammer it, go to the next one, hammer it, and continue. Another great thing about these is that they do accept many sizes of thread pretty easily shown, and the blue one is a 0.6 millimeter, black is a 0.8, and the white cream color is a 1 millimeter. So these are really easy to use no matter what kind of size you want to go for. If you go higher to like a 1.2 or a 1.5, you may have a harder time. And that goes the same with using something like cord, whether it's like a poly cord or a cotton cord. It is going to push out the shape of the holes that you punch with the chisel, but it is really nice to have something that you can buy any size thread and use it with, and it still look pretty flush. So next I want to go over something that's not as common, just because 1, I had it, and 2, you can use it still with stitching. But this is a lacing chisel or a thonging chisel. This tool is the same idea as the stitching chisel, except instead of a diamond shaped hole, you get a straight hole, which doesn't really look too great with thread in my opinion. And especially when you move on to something like polycord or any type of cord that's thicker than 1 millimeter. When you use this type of chisel with a regular harness needle or any type of leather needle for thread, it is going to have a kind of effect on the holes where it pushes out the holes when you go back and forth through them. Just because you're supposed to use a lacing needle with one of these, which is a flat needle that can go through these holes pretty easily. I just wanted to throw this one in there as well, just because it is a pretty inexpensive tool and it is easy to use, just like the diamond shaped stitching chisel, because it has the same idea where you find the center point of the line and then you just punch right through. Now you can see with using average thread, have the same idea of the blue is 0.6, black 0.8, and then 1 millimeter. And then with your regular thread, you can see that it's not really something you might use often or you might see often. And it will be harder to get around corners just because of the shape of the holes. Now I'm going to move on to something that I've been using lately, which is a hole punch. And I really like these just because you can use a lot thicker thread, or you can use a cord without ruining any type of shape that your hole punch is creating. Now, big downside to this is that it is a bit harder to get a straight even line throughout your entire project just because there is no center point on the holes. It also has a bit harder time getting through multiple layers of leather. I know for this one specifically, I can only really punch through 2 layers of 3 to 4 ounce leather. This means that it'll add some extra time to your project just because you may have to pre-punch holes and then hopefully they line up correctly when you put the layers together. But since it is a hole instead of a small shape, you will have a bit more room to kind of play with just in case the holes that you punch don't line up completely accurate. Now with other crafters, I've seen them punch through multiple layers of 2 to 3 ounce or 3 to 4 ounce leather using something like a Singer box, which that might be something you might look forward to in the future, but they are definitely not cheap. And just for one of them, it usually costs around $120 to $160. So that might be something, if you are going to continue to use a hole punch for your projects, you might want to look into. But for now, I'm just using a Tandy one, or I think I got this from Springfield Leather. But they all pretty much have the same one. I think you can even find these from Hobby Lobby. At first there was an issue with this one, just because after I used it a few times, the prongs did seem to rattle around a bit, which made it hard to get a even hole punch spacing each time. But to fix that, I just added a small piece of leather in between each of the prongs, and it has worked out pretty good, and it works for what I need it for right now. I think one of the main advantages of using a hole punch is that there's not really going to be a puckering effect on the backside. You will see a small press out just from the punches going through the leather, but it's not going to be cut like the diamond shaped stitching chisel where it kind of cuts the leather and then there's pieces of the leather that are still attached around it. Instead, after you stitch through the holes and kind of use a hammer to hammer it down or just press them down, it comes out pretty even and it looks really nice. And like I said, you can use thicker leather. So I've seen people use smaller leather and it looks fine, but here you can tell that I have the 0.6, 0.8, and the 1 millimeter. And I like the 1 to maybe even a higher thread would be good for it, or using a type of poly cord would be also really nice looking. So it really depends on what type of thread you might be trying to use and what size thread, whether you want the really small thread or if you want a really thick thread. And some punches will kind of complement the thread a bit more than other punches. So lastly, I want to go over the pricking iron, which is a pretty common one as well. And you definitely have seen pictures on Instagram or Reddit, and a lot of people use this for really nice looking stitching. A lot of times, especially with these, you will see people use a very thin thread where it's almost barely showing. And I think that's more of like a classier look as opposed to something like a hole punch. I'd say a big downside to using a pricking iron is that it is a bit more difficult to use as well as time consuming, especially if you use a traditional style method when using one of these, which is when you place the pricking iron into the line from your leather, you use some small force just to dent the leather, and then once it's dented, you won't punch all the way through. You use a stitching awl and you punch the rest of the way through and then stitch your leather that way. I have seen people just use a pricking iron and just punch all the way through the leather, which in that case it'll just end up being like a stitching chisel, like a diamond shaped stitching chisel, except your thread will be at more of a slant. But I do think when you use a pricking iron and a stitching awl, it will come out a lot nicer, and that's a lot of times what you see from photos of super clean stitching. Another downside of these is that it is usually hard to find a good quality for a cheaper price. Most of the time they start around $80 for a nice set of two or just one by itself. This is definitely one that I haven't used as much just because I am starting to like a lot thicker thread instead of the thinner thread, and these have a bit harder time handling something up to like a 1mm. And you can see that you have the same setup, and the 0.6 to me looks really nice, but once you get around 0.8 to 1mm, it does become a bit more chunkier. Obviously you can still use it and it works fine. I did punch right through the holes just like a stitching chisel for these ones, so if you were to use a stitching awl and just dent the holes, it does create a finer hole, which makes it a bit harder to take something like a 0.8mm or a 1mm. And that's another thing about using one of these pricking irons, is just like the hole punch, it is a bit more difficult to find the center point and continue an even straight line throughout your entire project. Now, if you were using a stitching awl with the pricking iron, you can kind of correct your mistakes since you're not fully punching through the holes. But if you were to just mallet right through the leather using one of these, you will just have a hole and you kind of have to just run with it. So I hope this helped anyone just by going over a few different stitching tools and just kind of showing the pros and cons behind each one. And there are different stitching tools out there that aren't here in this video. I just wanted to show these because especially the diamond shape stitching chisel, the hole punch, and the pricking iron are definitely some of the most common ones that you will see. I think another big factor of determining what type of stitching tool you want to use is figuring out what type of thread size you want to use or what type of thread you want to use. Like I said, if you want to use something really small, a pricking iron is going to work well with, whereas something thicker or even a cord, it might look a little harsh on the small slanted lines that it creates, so you might want to use a hole punch. I hope this helped someone get a better idea of the types of stitching chisels that I have here and the different sizes of thread they can use with each one. And if you want to see more pictures of each one of the tools and a thread sizing guide that I made for each one, you can go to the link below. I just have an article written up just going over the pros and cons like I did in this video. So hopefully this helped out, and I'll see you on the next video.